Hi. In this next set of models, we're going to talk about a very specific thing, growth. We're going to talk about economic growth, to be even more specific. We're going to ask, why is it that some countries are rich and other countries are poor? To put a framework around that, a model around that, we're going to start out by looking at an even simpler model, a model of exponential growth. So here's a model where you just put money in the bank and we talk about sort of the rate at which it grows and see how that accumulates over time. From that base model, we're then going to construct a model of a very primitive economy and show how economies grow. Now, one of the surprising results of that model of economic growth is going to be that there's limits, that without innovation, growth stops. So we're going to move from that simple model to something called the solo growth model. And the solo growth model allows for there to be innovation and shows how innovation has this sort of multiplier effect on our collective well-being and why innovation is so important. And then we'll talk a little bit about some extensions. In particular, we're talking about sort of, and once we've got this model, how do we use it to think about why some countries are successful and other countries aren't, and really what enables growth to continue over time. Okay, so to get us started, first we just need some basic definitions. So first, what do I mean by growth? Growth of what? Well, you could think of growth of overall human happiness, right? That'd be a nice thing to think about, but that's harder to measure in some respects, right? So we're going to focus on the same thing economists do, which is GDP. So this is gross domestic product. So this is just the total market value of all the goods and services produced within an economy. Okay, and there's data kept on this. So for example, if you look, here's a whole bunch of countries in the world and their GDP. So you see Luxembourg at the very top. If you look down a little ways, you'll see the United States right at 15th. And then we have a per capita GDP about 47,000. And further down and so on, you see Spain. And there's very poor countries where GDP is measured in the single digits, thousands of dollars per person. Okay. We want to know, though, what causes growth. So here's sort of an interesting graph, right? Here's Botswana and Zimbabwe. Now, these countries aren't the same, right? They're both in Africa, but Botswana only has about 2 million people. Zimbabwe has about 13 million people. So Zimbabwe is a much larger country. But if you look at GDP, right, you can see that Zimbabwe has pretty much stayed flat, right? It hasn't gone up from 1966 to 2005. Where in contrast, right, Botswana has been very successful. So we want to understand, what is it that enables one country to succeed and another country to not succeed? And we'll talk about a book by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson called Why Nations Fail, which really focuses on this line here, right? Like, why is it the case that Zimbabwe hasn't been successful? Now, if you look at GDP, when we talk about growth, what we mean is changes in GDP. Here's the annual change in real GDP since 1930 in the United States. When they say real, notice in the script they say real. When economists say real, what they mean is taking into account inflation. So if inflation goes up by 10%, but the economy went up by 15%, you've got to subtract off that 10% just due to prices rising. If you look at GDP in the United States, what you see during the war, right, there's huge increases in GDP. And then we had this sort of nice post-war period where growth was fairly high. But you notice it stays fairly high. So, it averages around, 3 to 4% throughout this whole range, right? You see occasional dips, but basically you see fairly, steady, constant rates of growth. But if you look from 2006 to 2011, right, when we had this contraction, you see this period here where growth fell. We had massive decreases in growth. And those are, people really feel that, right, because they're much worse off. Now, another thing we look at growth, you can ask sort of, can you sustain super high levels of growth? So if you look at China, you see these sort of unbelievable levels of growth, right? These things are all in the 8-9% range over the last few decades, of the last decade and a half. And so what you can think is, oh my God, is China going to become 50 times the size of the United States? Well, when I was a kid, people said the same thing about Japan. And if you look at Japan's growth rates, what we see is, again, from 1950 to the early 1980s, you see these huge growth rates. But then, if you notice since then, right, their growth rates have fallen. So one of the things this very simple model will do is explain why that's the case. Why can you sustain really high growth rates for a long time and then have them fall off once you sort of catch up to the other countries in the world? And this is why a lot of people, when you look at China, right, even though you see these high growth rates now, a lot of people expect those to fall in the future. We're going to start out by looking at exponential growth. And this is where you just put money in the bank and it just grows and grows and grows, up, 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 like this, right? But when we look at economic growth, it tends not to look that way, right? Over time, growth tends to fall off. And that's because we put money into things like machinery and technologies, but those depreciate over time, and that prevents us from getting that upward sloping curve. And so economic growth is often going to sort of go the other way. It's going to start out fast and then tail off, sort of like it did in Japan, unless we can get some innovation, and that'll shift the whole curve up. I'll show you what I mean in a minute. One last thing, though, before we get started. When you think about growth, right, that's focusing on material things, material wants. And you can ask yourself, okay, does this really matter? Shouldn't we be more interested in whether people are happy? And we probably should be, right? It's probably more important that we're happy than we have a lot of stuff. Like we'd all trade stuff for happiness. So there's a question, right? Does GDP, does higher growth make us happier? Well, that's actually a fairly complicated question. So here's a graph that shows GDP per capita, and then here's a measure of life satisfaction. So this is survey data on life satisfaction. Notice the problem here. GDP is what we can think of as really hard because we can measure it. Life satisfaction is sort of soft because you're surveying people. And so you ask me one day, I can say my life is great. You could ask me another day, and I might say, oh, my life isn't that great. So you've got to survey a lot of people. You've got to make sure you frame the question the right way. Still, with all those caveats, here's what you see. Does money make you happier? And I want to focus on two different parts of this graph. If you look in this region, the answer is no. As you go from 20,000 to 60,000, people just aren't that much happier. But if you look in this region, the answer is decidedly yes. Money does make you happier. Now, the reason for this may be just some basic services like healthcare, food, shelter, those sorts of things. So getting from 0 to 10,000, that's huge. Getting from 30,000 to 60,000, maybe that doesn't matter that much. So lifting people out of poverty clearly makes them happier. That's one reason to focus on GDP. Now, once you're making $100,000 a year, it may not make you any happier to make $120,000 a year. What we get is, does growth make you happy, at least according to survey data? Yes, if you're lifting poor people up. No, if you're making rich people richer. Okay, so that's the framework for what we're going to do. We're going to start out by talking about exponential growth, then we're going to move on to economic growth models, and we'll do three. We'll do a simple economic growth model, we'll do something called Solo's growth model, and then I'll talk just a tiny bit about something called endogenous growth models. All right, let's get started. Thank you.